time, but I began talking about it here, and in particular, the theme that I developed when I last spoke here was the notion of China as a constrained superpower, or Prometheus bound. So it was here in Kent Street that I first set out some of these ideas. My paper was well received and gave me confidence to write about it, which became my previous book, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New World Order, published in 2020, reprinted 4 times, and a second edition of it will be released in May this year. So thanks again to the AII. You've got me off on the right track. So tonight I would like to discuss my most recent book, as Ian said, Great Game On, The Contest for Central Asia and Global Supremacy. It was released in the middle of November last year and is now into its second print run. The thing I'm going to focus on tonight a bit more is this thing we're hearing a lot of these days under Trump 2.0, and that is this notion of a reverse Kissinger. It's started to pop up in the media, and you know what I mean by a reverse Kissinger, and Trump really is the biggest shock to global geopolitics since Putin's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. Unilaterally, Trump has opened direct negotiations over an end to fighting, direct negotiations with Russia over an end to end fighting in Ukraine. He's brought Russia and Putin in from the cold and cold-shouldered the Europeans and tossed a large pail of icy water over Ukraine. In trying to fathom the abruptness of these changes and to give them some logical coherence and serious rationalisation, talk has started about what is rapidly becoming known as reverse Kissinger. By this, it's meant that Trump is pursuing a deliberate strategy to realign Russia with the US against China. It'll be recalled by everyone here, I'm sure, that that Kissinger, as Nixon's national security advisor, buried the ideological differences to align China with the US against the Soviet Union. For both China and the US, the Soviet Union was deemed to be a far greater threat to the security of each than China and the US were to each other. Before Trump's election, on occasions, in his meandering long speeches, he would sometimes assert that in office he intended to break the two big authoritarian powers, China and Russia, apart. He never made clear if that meant aligning with China against Russia or with Russia against China. It's likely that he didn't know then, and he may not even know now. But that seems to be his intention. At the time, and even now, to many, the notion of separating China and Russia would seem preposterous. After all, it was only in February 2022, on the eve of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that President Xi and Putin declared that their countries had a friendship without limits. Both Xi and Putin had met by then some 43 times, bilaterally and in multilateral forums. China refused to criticise the invasion of Ukraine, though it also refused to endorse it. From Putin's pivot to the east after the imposition of sanctions on Russia following the Crimean annexation in 2014, both Russia and China had drawn increasingly closer together. Both leaders shared a deeply sour antipathy towards the US-led West. Bilateral engagement, especially military and security exercises, grew layers of thick sinew. Both China and Russia spruiked their relationship as a new model of great power competition. They sought to contrast it to the hegemonic Western approaches which have all too often led to armed conflict. In these circumstances, Trump's musings on splitting the two apart and, in effect, doing a reverse Kissinger looked at best highly improbable. In fact, what is viewed as a close alignment between Russia and China has led some in the West to speak of a single theatre of global contest between these authoritarian states and the West, of the axis of autocracy, of democracy versus autocracy, and so on. In my book, Great Game On, I call this the Chasha anxiety, a compression of China and Russia. I seek to challenge head-on the myth of a united autocratic front faced by the US-led West. I concluded that in fact more divides Russia and China than binds them together, and that the Chinese anxiety belongs alongside others, such as the 19th century Russia threat or the China threat today. That in the past and present, these have been used by strategic analysts, think tanks, the media and politicians to justify belligerent behaviour and ever more bloated defence budgets. My book was written well before the November US presidential elections, but I speculated on not only the possibility of a reverse Kissinger, but the need to pursue it as an important geopolitical policy objective. At first sight, what I propose seems even more improbable than Trump's, if that is what he's really trying to do by putting a friendly arm around Putin's shoulders. I will leave it to the end to explain my reverse Kissinger, which is not what people are talking about in the case of US and Russia. But before we start, I'd just like to talk a little bit about The Great Game, which is the main title of the book, before turning to the Cheshire Anxiety. Obviously, Great Game in the title of the book is drawn from the British-Russian imperial contest across Central Asia in the 19th century and concluding in 1907 with a treaty between Great Britain and Russia. For my current book, The Great Game is the power shift occurring across Eurasia now, from west to east, from Russia to China. This follows the previous great power shift in our lifetimes, that from the US to China across the Pacific. But as China achieves preeminence in Eurasia, a new great game has begun between China and the US for global preeminence. I should also provide some definitions before we move on. Eurasia, for me, is that vast as sort of a movable feast or variable geometry, however you like to think of it, or as Humpty Dumpty said, it is whatever I say it is. Eurasia is that, for me, in the book, the vast area from the Vistula River in Poland to the Sea of Japan. Core Eurasia I define as comprising the 5 Central Asian states, plus Afghanistan and Mongolia, and Central Asia, of course, are the 5 states, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. So let's turn to the Cheshire Anxiety with all that background. On 4th of February 2022, during one of his many visits to Beijing, Putin and Xi Jinping captured world headlines with their joint statement that Russia and China's friendship was with no limits. It was a no-limits partnership. Made at the time when Putin was amassing forces on the border with Ukraine for an invasion, which few thought would actually occur. 18 days later, Putin did the unthinkable and ordered his troops to cross the border under the rubric of a special operation. As we all soon discovered, it was a full-scale military invasion. The timing of the announcement of the no-limits friendship and the invasion made China look complicit in the breach of one of the most fundamental principles of international law, the sanctity of national borders. But there is, in fact, no evidence that China was in on it or that Putin had given Xi any advance warning. The Chinese government, for example, was caught flat-footed with some 6,000 students exposed to Russian military operations and requiring emergency consular evacuation. The Ukraine invasion was at odds also with one of China's core foreign policy principles, non-interference in another country's affairs. Before the 4th of February statement, Russia and China's ever closer relationship was already leading to rising concern in the West and leading to loose media commentary about the axis of authoritarian states. Despite the growing closeness up to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia had maintained fairly strict limits on arms sales to China, especially involving advanced technologies. For its part, China's trade and investment, including in energy infrastructure and pipelines, which Moscow eagerly sought, also remained limited. For example, the power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline, which is of immense strategic value to Russia, as it would allow it to divert gas sales from Europe to China, has been under discussion for nearly 2 decades now, and there seems to be no progress in sight. Russia has also been careful to strengthen its relations with India, an erstwhile competitor of China, and with North Korea, a dangerously loose cannon on China's sensitive Korean border. For Beijing, Kim Jong-un sending 10,000 plus troops to fight with Russia in Ukraine was as much about demonstrating to China that the DPRK had other, more important friends, and thus options other than relying on China. It was noteworthy that after visiting Beijing following his re-election in May, during which no substantive announcements were made, Putin in quick succession visited North Korea, where a long-lapsed mutual security agreement was refreshed and signed, and then Hanoi, and received a visit by Prime Minister Modi of India, significantly Modi's first overseas visit since being re-elected. While most commentators saw messages aimed exclusively at the West in Putin's post-election flurry of diplomatic activity, I have, for example, in my AFR columns, instead drawn attention to the messages Putin is sending to China. Putin wants to unsettle China, whom he sees as becoming too comfortable in its new role as a senior partner in the Russia-China relationship. Putin is saying to Beijing that although Russia has been isolated diplomatically by the West, and he has turned much more to the East, Russia has friends and other options in the East apart from China. It's a message that Russia's elites, who feel increasingly uncomfortable with Russia's junior partner role in Eurasia alongside China, would be wanting to hear from Putin. Russia and China's interests and geopolitical alignment diverge over different approaches to achieving security, their historical relations, and ongoing territorial issues which have been swept under the carpet rather than resolved, also their respective roles in Central Asia and their different engagement and integration with the international system. Taking the different approaches to security, for example, Russian thinking about how to achieve its security was permanently shaped by the horrid experiences of the Mongol invasions and the occupation of Muscovy. The Mongols invaded Muscovy in 1240 and remained until around 1500. With the invasion of the land of the Rus, much of traditional Russian culture was destroyed, cities laid to waste, and swathes of the Russian population enslaved. With the collapse of the Mongol Empire, over time, the Rus reasserted themselves and re-embraced Slavic and Russian orthodoxy. Importantly, they understood their vulnerability on the vast plains of Eurasia and concluded that they needed to occupy as much territory as possible around them to act as buffer states. This mentality exists today and in part motivates Putin. In 2016, when asked by a schoolboy during a school visit, "Mr. Putin, where does Russia end?" Putin immediately replied, "Russia ends nowhere." In contrast, China's thinking about security comes from the view that the emperor is the son of heaven, ruling over the middle kingdom of earth, to which all other people are subservient. Historically, this has led China to seek its security by surrounding itself with client or tributary states, to be achieved by diplomacy, commerce, bribery, or whatever other means work. What is essential for the system is that the emperor is acknowledged to be superior by the payment of tribute or gifts to the emperor. This has not, however, been a system through which to transfer wealth from the tributary state to the imperial realm. It had often been the case that the tribute-paying supplement left with a far more valuable gift than that which was given. Otherwise, the emperor would have lost face. The gift-giving and exchanges were to reaffirm the celestial order by which the emperor's right to rule was reaffirmed. It came to be an elaborate ritual. Of course, if surrounding peoples did not participate as expected, violence was also at hand, as with the Qing's 18th century genocide of the Mongolian Zungar people on China's far northwestern frontier. So basically, what I'm arguing is that their approach to security is fundamentally at odds, and that's one of the first of a number of deep underlying tensions in the relationship. Turning to the historical record, after the collapse of the Mongols, the Russian Empire began its centuries-long expansion eastward as the Russians sought lands for security. By the mid-17th century, the expanding Russian Empire began to press on the Qing Empire, which itself was expanding north and west. The Treaty of Nechitz was signed between them in 1689. It's a fascinating treaty because it was negotiated by Jesuit monks, and it was only 2 years later that it had been translated into Chinese and the court actually knew what it had signed. The Qing had, however, the upper hand by virtue of larger military forces and Russia's disadvantage of distance. Moscow's disadvantage of distance at the time. This gave the Manchus control of land north of the Amur River and east of the Pacific Ocean. By virtue of remoteness, as much as anything else, this treaty settled border relations between China and Russia for the next 200 years. Trade flowed across the shared border of more than 4,000 kilometres, and territory was largely respected. But by the mid-19th century, the power balance had shifted decisively from the ailing Qing regime to the ascendant Russian Tsar. In two treaties, Beijing, 1850, and Peking, 1860, all Chinese territory in what is today eastern Siberia, the Russian Far East, and the Pacific Ocean, was ceded to Russia. These were two of the most egregious unequal treaties of the 19th century against which the Chinese Communist Party today still rails in its propaganda, but it never mentions the territory lost to Russia. But it wasn't always like this. Chairman Mao once said of these lands that China has yet to present Moscow with the bill. Both Russia and the Soviet Union involved themselves at different times in Xinjiang. Both saw Xinjiang as a natural part of their imperial territories in Central Asia, east of the Tian Shan Mountains. On occasions, the Soviet Union also supported East Turkestan independence movements. When the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, Mao had expected to be treated as a revolutionary equal by Moscow. Instead, Stalin treated him like a little brother. Stalin and his successor Khrushchev both regarded Mao as a potential threat to their leadership of the international communist world and to world peace. For Beijing, Moscow never provided the support they believed they should receive, led them into a devastating war in the Korean Peninsula, and supported capitalist India against communist China in the 1961 war. The Sino-Soviet split that began that year lasted until 1989. In 1969, serious fighting broke out on the Ussuri River. Frequent fighting also occurred along the Xinjiang frontier, and on one occasion, Beijing's ruling elite were dispersed around the country for fear of an imminent Soviet nuclear attack. During the Deng Xiaoping years, relations gradually improved, but the final border demarcations were not settled until as recently as 2006, when Putin was by then president of Russia. When today Xi and Putin are at pains to ignore the past, events occur which remind us of strong nationalist sentiment in China, which is still festering below the surface, especially with regards to what is believed to be the 1 million square kilometres of land in Manchuria that still is in Russian territory. Nationalist bloggers from time to time raise these lands, calling on Beijing to demand their return. There was one case when Xi was going to Moscow in 2022, and a very famous blogger in Shanghai said that if Xi Jinping was serious about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is of course his signature policy that ties everything else together, then he should ask Putin for all that land back. Of course, it only lasted for about 3 hours and it was taken down, but had a huge number of hits in that time. In April 23, this is very interesting, the names on Chinese maps showing Russian cities like Vladivostok were ordered by the Chinese government. 8 cities that are currently in Russia, the names of 8 cities currently in Russia, and now have to be shown on Chinese official maps by their original pre-Russian name. So Vladivostok, for example, was Heishanman. Vladivostok, of course, means in English, translated to English, conqueror of the East. So you know what the Russians are on about. But Heishanman is just a little fishing village. But that now is the official name for Vladivostok in Chinese maps. And Russia alone, of the 19th century imperial powers, is still yet to return any lands taken under the unequal treaties. For its part, Russians fear the Chinese intend one day to colonize the resource-rich and sparsely populated lands of the Russian Far East. And increasingly, I think the extent to which Ukraine has depleted Russia militarily probably means that Moscow knows that all of that territory not only now is undefended, but other than using nuclear weapons, is undefendable. It doesn't mean China will press its advantage, but Moscow realizes that it's got this extreme vulnerability now in the east. And of course, Chinese farmers and migrants are crossing the border and doing business and taking land and so on. And there's a lot of personal level tension as a result. But there's a big contest also in Central Asia. Russia consolidated the mainly Muslim lands of lands west of the Tianshan Mountains into its empire in the 1870s. Both Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union controlled and ran these lands from Moscow. With the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, these lands, known as Central Asia, soon became independent states. Russian influences remained strong, especially through language, education, networks among Russian and Central Asian elites, and especially military and security ties. But since the early 2000s, China's economic power has risen inexorably, drawing these states closer to China. Under Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it had been common to refer to China, until Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it had been common to refer to Russia and China as having a division of labor in Central Asia. Russia provided military and security guarantees, while China's role was economic and investment. But since the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been depleted militarily. It has had to shift vast resources from east to the western front, and it has lost prestige and influence. At the same time, China has become a more active and consequential security partner, while its economic influence continues to expand. And China's interest also now has been increased substantially with the return of the Taliban to Kabul and the fear of the spread of Islamic fundamentalism in Central Asia and how it will spill over the border into Xinjiang. It has now become common to speak of Russia as China's junior partner in Central Asia. This is something Russian elites are unsettled by, and it adds to a feeling of distrust towards China. Finally, and very briefly, China and Russia's engagement with the international system are vastly different. Russia has been under various forms of sanctions for the past 11 years, but even before then, it was mainly a major exporter of hydrocarbons with a very narrow manufacturing base to its economy. The exception being, of course, Russia's military-industrial establishment, which was and remains a major international arms supplier and manufacturer. By contrast, for 2 decades, China has been the world's biggest exporter of manufactured goods. It's the biggest trading partner for much of the world's economy. It is also heavily dependent on world markets for much of the energy and resources it needs for its own economic growth to be sustained. And that's one of the main reasons in my last book I argued that China was Prometheus-bound, or a constrained superpower. Unlike Russia, China is utterly dependent on world markets for everything it needs to keep its economic engines going. So China is therefore far more vulnerable to Western sanctions than Russia is. It also has huge quantities of its foreign exchange reserves held in the West, and its elites and middle class educate their children in the West in large numbers. Chinese elites do not see China's future as part of a rump of renegade states limited to Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Putin's invasion of Ukraine therefore created enormous dilemmas for China's leaders. For all these reasons, when asked by the Australian Foreign Affairs Journal to write about this in July 2022, just 5 months after the Friendship Without Limits Declaration and Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I said it was a concert of convenience between Putin and Xi. I suggested it was like the von Ribbentrop-Molotov non-aggression pact of 1949, also with a limited shelf life. Interestingly, Friendship Without Limits has long disappeared from Chinese propaganda and other statements about the relationship. The question then now, is this relationship structurally stable or unstable? And that's where we have to form a judgment with all of that other information in mind. 24 23. 2 years ago, Philip Stone, in his magisterial study of the Russia-China relationship, published in 23, concluded that despite all the ups and downs, it was reasonable to expect that relations would settle into a long-run pattern of stability. And this is certainly the line that both the Russian and Chinese governments wish to present. Stowe's conclusion seems to me, however, to rest too heavily on the fact that the relationship was quite stable for over 200 years following the signing of the Treaty of Minsk. But what Stowe seems to ignore is that the moment power shifted in Russia's favour in the mid-19th century, Moscow moved immediately to exploit China's weakness to its own advantage with the treaties of Anjun and Peking. And I think we're now, as I said at the opening, we're living through the second great power shift of this century, and this is the power shift from Russia to China. And I believe China has moved quickly to exploit Russia's weaknesses and press its advantages in Central Asia. This will mainly serve to reinforce mutual suspicion and mistrust while boosting China's confidence. One day Beijing may present, as Chairman Mao forewarned, the bill to Russia for all the territory it occupied under the unequal treaties. So to conclude, with China becoming the preeminent power in Eurasia, it's necessary to find a means to balance China for world order. If, as seems ever more likely under Trump 2.0, the US withdraws from its previous role of seeking to ensure order in the world and becomes ever more inward-looking, then the big question is, who will balance China in Eurasia? As the dominant power in Eurasia, China will now be free, as it's already doing, to project power globally and through maritime means. Accordingly, I suggest that a different reverse Kissinger than the one usually discussed of the US and Russia balancing China, I argue at the end of my book that it is absolutely in Europe's geopolitical interest to re-Europeanize Russia after Putin's left the scene in order to balance China in Eurasia, because nothing else will balance China in Eurasia. And Russia's natural home is in Europe, not the East. Thank you.
I do a daily update on the Russia-Ukraine war, or should I say Russia's war against Ukraine. It seems to me that the Chinese must be absolutely furious just under the surface, or perhaps not quite so far under the surface, with Putin having sprung this on them, because it would appear to me this has completely screwed the entire Belt and Road Initiative, about which we haven't been hearing so much lately.
Yeah, a very good question to start with. Great way to start the season. Look, you're absolutely right, John, that Beijing hates what's happening in Ukraine. And they had a very, very strong relationship with Ukraine before the invasion. Their first aircraft carrier was a Ukrainian aircraft carrier. And the thing is about what's happened, what Beijing doesn't like, which troubles it the most, is that the one thing it doesn't want is for Putin to fail. Not because they love Putin, far from it, or trust him, far from it. They fear more than anything else a coloured revolution in Russia. And this terrifies the living daylights out of Beijing. So they need Putin to succeed, so the alternative, which is worse, doesn't happen. So I think I describe it as they feel as if they're riding a tiger. And they're not quite sure how to manage all of this. But that's the sort of, I think, the China-Russia dynamic. On the BRI, it's gone into different phases. It's no longer the big headline, blah, blah, blah initiative. Every single thing that's done overseas by Chinese enterprises are no longer wrapped up with the BRI ribbon, as they were. But it's alive and well, with all sorts of infrastructure investments, particularly across Central Asia. They're still building railways, pipelines, you name it. But also it's extended heavily into Latin America. And I think what you've seen over the last few years is BRI morphing into a more deliberate strategy to build China's presence in what we call now the Global South. But it's alive and well. Although less well funded than it was, because China's got its own domestic economic problems. Miss that.
Very, very interesting as always. Recently there's been, in fact in the last week, there's been fuss among Australia's military complex about two Chinese frigates having live firing exercises in the South China Sea, in the ditch between Australia and New Zealand, the Tasman Sea. Would you agree with me that this is a subtle reminder to Australia that if you're going to keep persisting in having exercises in what we regard as our territory in the South China Sea, this is increasingly what's going to happen in Australia? Or do you see some more dastardly outward threat from this?
No, Richard, I could not agree more. The only thing where I disagree with you is the use of the adjective subtle. There's nothing none too subtle about it. And Beijing is sure, because Beijing has finally figured out that Australians don't do subtlety. So it has to be in your face before the message is being delivered.
But they've given up diplomacy, the brutal diplomacy they had before. Warrior diplomacy, I think that's gone, hasn't it?
Yes, thank goodness. And it was a massive own goal. Look, I've just been in Beijing and talking to people just shaking their heads that they ever went down that path.
Chris Skinner, 30-year Navy veteran. What China is doing is exactly what the British Empire did 150 years ago. They're extending their maritime reach. They're projecting the maritime capability that they have. It's perfectly predictable and understandable, and I don't think Australia should feel threatened by that happening. My question, though, is in your 2020 book, you discussed a grand strategy for Australia. In the meanwhile, we've had Trump 2.0, but more importantly, the Ukraine war. Have you any reason to change what you said 4 years ago, 5 years ago?
It's very current for me because I've just submitted the text for the second edition, and I don't like to have to retype the page. That's why DFAT training, don't retype the page. But I did do a new introduction, and look, I think what I said 4 years ago stacks up pretty well in the current situation. I agree very much with your first point as well, because that's what I'm saying in this book. That now China's the preeminent power in Eurasia, it no longer has to worry about frontier security in Eurasia. It's secure within its land borders for the first time in 3,000 years. Now, it hasn't just happened overnight, and China's been building its naval capacity for the last 15 years or so. But that's exactly what you predict from having secured frontiers, achieved its frontier security. It's now projecting power globally.
And it's reinforcing their commercial role in being the world's trading partner.
Yeah, no, for sure. And as you said, like Britain, Britain was, global empire, and it had global maritime power to do that. Now, this could be the next book. I'm not sure. I'm still getting over the last one. But what does it mean when China projects power globally? What does China becoming a global hegemon really mean? Is it going to be like the US? Is it really only concerned about the first island chain and the territory in North Asia that's closest to it? What does it really mean? So that's sort of got to be resolved, I think, and it's not very clear. It's probably not clear in Beijing's mind, but there's no evidence to think that China would be a colonizer, a hegemonic power in that way. So that needs to be worked through and discussed and thought through. And of course, don't forget the 1 million square kilometres sitting up in Manchuria. That's not going to stay there forever. It's just, I think, now that China doesn't need to press its advantage.
Thank you. My name is David Kelly. I'm called the Principal Associate of a little startup called China Policy. And we analyse, and I spend a lot of time translating matters that I know Jeff is covering also. I would like to take the discussion past the idea of reverse Kissinger to what we could call Yalta 2.0. That has been in the Chinese media over this week, particularly in Shanghai, in a media platform that I look at a lot called Observer, Guanchaja, which is owned by Mr. Eric X. Lee, who is ever so slightly contrarian, but is a nationalist. Yalta 2.0 is looking to a meeting between not just Xi and Putin, but Xi, Putin and Trump, which will echo the meeting of Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin. What these people have in common is illiberalism, I would suggest. None of them are particularly keen on democracy. And so we now have a new form of ideological common ground that we have to deal with in this country. We are afflicted, in my opinion, with the Murdoch media. I apologise to those of you who subscribe to it. But its days are limited, it seems to me, because even Mr. Murdoch and Lachlan Murdoch are not going to find a happy home in the common spiritual atmosphere of Yalta 2.0. And my final point that I'd like Jeff to ruminate on is that what I see every day coming from Beijing, not just for domestic audience, but for the world audience, is the notion of a spiritual China, which is one of the three, that China has now three new foreign policy doctrines, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. And this word civilization is used over and over again, and it has been thought in the past that China sees a common civilizational link with Russia, but they were both anti-Western to the core. And in fact, that was the one thing you could say about these three initiatives. The driving motivation was to be anti-Western. So if Mr. Trump now opts into Yalta 2.0, where does this leave Western civilization, and what should Australia say about civilization?
There's a lot there, David. All very good points, all taken. There's not much I can actually added commentary to that. What I would say, though, and seeing James Curran here as well, the difficulty for Australia, I think, with Trump, is that we have so comprehensively aligned ourselves with the US in every respect because of values. That if Trump, which it seems to be, doesn't really understand or care about US exceptionalism, and therefore doesn't seek US primacy, that he is free to have all sorts of deals with China that we would find very, very distasteful in terms of our values and what we would want to prioritise in foreign policy. And I think therein is a big sleeper for the Australian government that's not recognised yet, or maybe it is, but no one talks about it because it's too awful to talk about it. And that is, there will be, I think, an ever-increasing number of issues, real issues like climate change, maybe registration of medicines, legislation dealing with big data companies, goes on and on and on, where we will find ourselves at odds with the Trump administration. And that is going to be a big challenge for Canada.
This guy, New Australia.
Yes, exactly.
I'll promise you the next one.
Mike Mitchell, my day job, I'm a lawyer, Key Point Law, ignore that. Follow foreign affairs a lot. Want to put a couple of propositions to you, see what you think. The first is that Russia's land links, trade links to China have been at maximum capacity for years. Russia has not had the economic capacity to improve them, which will be quite difficult, leaving aside Ukrainian partisans blowing them up over the past couple of years. China also showing no sign of interest in the investment required to extend them. Secondly, this is not too radical, China is continuing quietly to work on the land links through Central Asia to Europe. Third thing, Friedrich Merz, the new Chancellor, has already raised the issue of effectively forming a new NATO without the USA. Germany, France, Poland, other places are raising money and pouring it into Ukraine. They won't allow it to fall. Assuming that does happen and Russia eventually has to give up, what do you think the attitude of Beijing will be to a Europe that has effectively cut its ties to the USA but hasn't fundamentally changed in the way that NATO has regarded its foreign policy? It's just NATO without the USA.
Well, I think you saw last week Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Europe schmoozing, and I think Beijing sees this as an opportunity, absolutely an opportunity to create a bigger rift in the transatlantic alliance relationships and to get closer to Europe. And Europe's in a difficult position on this because they're also heavily dependent on Chinese trade as well. So a very substantial economic basis to that. And I think you may see Europe revisiting its assessment of China as a strategic competitor, much of which it did under enormous pressure from the United States under Trump 1.0 and then particularly under Biden. So I think it really goes a bit to David's point. Once these sorts of big pieces start to move, everything is set in train, everything is set in motion. And we are eyewitnesses in our own lifetime now to perhaps one of the biggest disjunctions ever in the international system. Certainly as big as sort of at the end of the First World War.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Mimi Zoe from University of New South Wales. It's really fantastic to be here. I think this is one of the, as you know, I've been sort of been at lots of your book launches, speaking in Melbourne a few months ago, and I think I'd like to thank the Australian Institute of International Affairs for really, I think, one of the best crowds I've seen so far. Because I've been to quite a few, as a Joe's good friend, quite a few of his book launches. So well done, everyone in the crowd. This is excellent. I was going to ask a question about Europe, but I think the previous, the gentleman there really nailed it in his question. So I want to turn, though, to priorities. And in the US-China relationship right now, there are lots of things going on. And Ukraine may be one of these things going on, but there's also many things we know in terms of economic tariffs and AI. You had a very nice piece on DeepSeek recently. There's obviously issues around Taiwan. And so I just wonder, and Russia has not had a strong position on many of these. I don't suddenly see Russia, for example, in the domain of AI anywhere close. In fact, many other areas of deep technologies that China is now on par with the US. I mean, Russia's not even close. So on many of the key issues in the US-China relationship where Russia really, in my mind, is not really involved, how important is this sort of, what the dynamics you've explained in your book, the relationship between China and Russia going to be in this kind of new, maybe it's China-US relations 2.0 under Trump?
Thanks, Betty. What I'm trying to make a case for in one part of the book, does other things as well, is to try and knock on the head this notion of Chasha, what I call the Chasha anxiety. Just like in the 19th century there was a Russian anxiety, and a bit like the China threat so-called today. And by identifying the things that divide them, and certainly, as David said, both Xi and Putin are very deeply anti-Western. It doesn't mean they're anti-Western in the same way. And David would know, I mean, the Chinese elites look very favourably to the US. I try to make the point, I tried to in my comments just now, that Russia is integrated, but China is integrated in the international system in vastly different ways than Russia. It's just too superficial to say they're both authoritarian systems. Russia is a hydrocarbons economy, basically, with a big military industry. China is everything you have just said. And China is going to be an international standards setter. It is going to participate in these different forums. And if it doesn't feel its voice is being heard enough in these forums, it's going to create its own standards and its own global regulations. And one of the things I argue in the book, taking this concept from John Mearsheimer, is that what we now see has emerged in the international multipolar system. We are in a multipolar system now. It's not coming, it's not over the horizon. We are living in the middle of it. And all these events that we find discordant, unusual, surprising, they're all a function of a multipolar system. Like the last part of my last book described Australia's foreign policy future as dystopian. And the publisher at the time said, you can't use that word dystopian, it's too strong. And really, I said, no, because once you're in a multipolar world, for Australia, it's dystopian. We only had a smooth and comfortable existence when we had one great power with whose values we aligned are looking after us. And quite clearly, that's not going to be Trump 2.0. So these are all things of the multipolar world. But is there any order? Can we perceive any order in this multipolar world? And I argue, yes. I said, following Mearsheimer, I think the order has evolved into two bounded orders, using Mearsheimer's phrase. One US-led Western order, and one Chinese-led order. And the orders are linked very much by values. The Chinese order are much more authoritarian and tolerant of authoritarian systems. You could argue that democratic Brazil is part of China's order, but it's also quite tolerant of authoritarian ways of political and social organisation. So, and so there's values that link the participants of the different orders, but there are also institutions. And I spent a lot of time in the book talking about how deliberate China's been about building its own institutional framework around its order. There's Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road we talked about, the BRICS, the New Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I mean, that was explicitly in response to China's inability to reform the IMF. And now, last year, in the face of Putin, Xi creates the C plus C5, China plus the Central Asian 5. And Russia's not at the table. Yeah, there's Russia's sphere of influence. It has been. Well, that's what Moscow thought. But China's got another message from Moscow. It ain't any longer. It's now China's sphere of influence. And they're going to meet twice a year. They're going to biannually. And the secretary's going to be in Xi'an. And what's Xi'an? That's the historic start of the old Silk Road. So all this stuff's happening, and that's how the order is changing. I think it's not that these bounding orders, in my view, or Mearsheimer's, are mutually exclusive. They can interact and overlap, but that gives structure to otherwise a completely chaotic multipolar system.
3 questions, first of all, Alison, Brian, Jeremy, and Peter, and then we'll be about the person.
That sounds so relieved.
You don't have to stop, up to you.
Jeff, we're all looking forward to your new book, but your mention of Mearsheimer reminds me, you were probably here when he came to Australia 2 or 3 years ago and said quite, at the Institute of Public Affairs, said quite bluntly, it was up to Australia to decide whose side we were on, and if we chose the worst side, it'd be the worst for us. And that meant, if you guys, you're talking about a dystopian foreign policy, that is exactly what he was recommending for Australia. Now, I know that some of his views have changed a little bit since then, but I still think that his main agenda about China is US hegemony. Would you agree? And where does that leave us?
Yeah, I agree. That's, and I use the sort of bound orders as a sort of conceptual way. I'm not using them in a predictive way, which he does. And I agree, he's about US hegemony, but in a sense that's his job, how to maintain US hegemony, right? And he firmly believes, his classic book, The Tragedy of Great Powers, it all must end in tears, it all must end in war. And I don't think any of that's preordained at all, nor is it necessary, right? So where does it leave us? Well, I think the point is, Alison, and I'm sure you'd agree, we've already chosen. We've made the choice. We've made it in the most fundamental way, and nothing symbolises that more than AUKUS. And this is the contradiction at the heart of Australian foreign policy presently, or at present, or as James would say, we speak with a forked tongue. So we talk about being part of Asia and with our neighbours and not choosing sides or whatever. That's what we say, but what we do is profoundly to the extent we've chosen. We've chosen, there's no question. So that's where we are. And that's what makes it so much so dystopian for us. And particularly if the US does turn out under Trump to be an unreliable ally. Now, they'll cut your tongue out in Canberra if you dare say the US is an unreliable ally. But what happened to US aid? Does anyone notice that? Who's going to fill the gap in the Pacific? Now, Kurt Campbell subcontracted the Pacific to us to look after. Okay, well, that was one administration. Administration changes. There's going to be no US aid in the Pacific. So it's us or nobody. Or we just let the Chinese in. I must say my own view of the Pacific is it seems a long way from Australia. I'm not sure what damage China can do to us being in the Pacific, but people seem to decide that it's an immediate imminent threat to Australia's security. But you can argue that out. But certainly the fact is US aid's gone, pulled out by Trump, and who picks up the weight in the Pacific now? That is an unreliable ally, and that's what the government's going to have to come to grips with at some point. It could be even bigger things than Pacific security. Right? What David said, I mean, if you have a the Alpha 2.0, all sorts of spheres of influence could be carved up.
Even the Pope is wonky at the moment.
So?
We can't even trust the Pope anymore. He's on the Pope. He's around the group.
Yeah. He's come back, I think. He's had a hand. He's been given a lift.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. I think some of the questions are already taken out, some of what I was saying, or your last answer did, and this question is going to go to James anyhow next week. Given that I'd actually put Trump 2.0 as already thrown out most of our security blanket, even though we're not admitting it publicly, and that the FBI files look like they're being open to public scrutiny and or have become already compromised, where does that lead, our Five Eyes commitment, noting that some of the people in this room probably once were spies, and never, and B, should we expect anything to be delivered from AUKUS, or else just a payment to Trump 2.0 in his coffers? And then finally, C, do we start asking about Tyndale, Northwest Cape and Pine Gap?
Well, I mean, that's the last one is the point we've chosen. We're not going to ask. Five Eyes is interesting. I sound like one of the mad Margo types, but there is a security deep state. I worked at O&A my first time, and when I first joined the government, I worked in O&A for a couple of years. There is a security deep state, and that, I suspect, will survive Trump 2.0, whoever comes next. As for the rest, yeah, on AUKUS, I never pretend I'm expert on the security, strategic, or the manufacturing side of it. My interest in AUKUS really is the foreign policy dimension, and for me, AUKUS is a down payment of our ability to have an independent standing in our region, and an abrogation of nearly everything the last half century of Australian foreign policy has been directed at, as Dick Woolcock would have said, taking our security in Asia, or keeping it rather, taking our security in Asia, not from Asia. I think the symbolism of it's a disaster. And then I read in the paper today, as all of you have, that we've only got about a quarter of our ships going. There's only about 1 or 2 submarines that are operating. We have a massive defence capability deficit. None of it's going to be fixed anytime soon. It's not going to be fixed by AUKUS. But we've paid the price in foreign policy terms because we've said who we're with. We've made it clear. We've made it clear we're not with our neighbours. Our neighbours that don't want to be forced to make a choice between the US and China, who have made an art of strategic ambiguity. We're not us. No need for us to be subtle or ambiguous. We've got to be very clear. Now, whether we're back the right horse or not, Nelson, I don't know, but that's the problem for AUKUS. It may come, it may be our saviour, but it's so far out. Meanwhile, we've paid what I think is a very high price in foreign policy terms.
Peter.
You've addressed them so far.
It's on. Jeff, Peter Phillips, mindful of the fact that you just arrived from China, mindful of the excellence, the depth of your range of contacts at very high levels in China, mindful of the fact that we are just cruising up towards the halfway mark in Xi Jinping's third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, and that the second half of this third term is going to be a very, very interesting time. I wonder whether you might have had any awareness, any indication from your contacts while you've been in China of any inclination towards or move towards possible collection of that debt at any time during Xi Jinping's remaining term in office, whether he goes past third term or not?
Yeah, look, very good question. I defer to David on that, really. David reads so deeply and closely the sources. No one talks about it. You know, you can raise it in conversation and you get a sort of very vague, general, polite answer. No one really knows. But some of you may have seen the review I did last year of Steve Tung's book on the thought of Xi Jinping. And I concluded that review with something I firmly believe, that what makes China different than Russia is the Communist Party. And CPC, 97 million people, exists to exist. And it will do whatever's necessary to remain in power, even if that's to jettison Xi at some point, bring someone else in. So you see it so often, right? And it's often glossed over. Zero COVID, clearly Xi Jinping policy, clearly started to produce a reaction against the party, and it's dropped overnight. Wolf warrior diplomacy, they figured out it was counterproductive. Clearly Xi Jinping policy, gone. I mean, there's a whole lot of things you can look at like that. So there is dynamics within the party, but the party is an institution. So when Xi, say he and I are both snakes, we're both the same age. We had the opportunity once when I accompanied him to Australia to have a long discussion about these things. That's snakes, right? Here, astrology. Nothing more profound. That's astrology, right? And I don't even believe in the stuff, but anyway. So he falls off the perch, but there is still an institution, the party. So you sort of know what China's going to look like once Xi is gone. But you have no idea what Russia will look like once Putin's gone. None whatsoever. I think that's a very significant difference that needs to be kept in mind all the time. And I actually think it's all overdone. I mean, there are journalists that can't write anything unless it's Xi Jinping said this, Xi Jinping did that, Xi Jinping policy, So, Xi was supposed to have killed off the private sector. And last week he's meeting Jack Ma in Beijing and, sucking up to them all. I mean, there's a dynamism there. It's very hard to know how long you'll stay, but I think you know that after he's gone, it'll look pretty much like it looks now.
Jeremy?
Jeff, just going back to that, Yalta 2, we have a dictator, somebody desperately trying to be a dictator, and a democratic system which is falling apart even before Trump came in. And then we have Putin top down, rapidly top down in the way in which the government functions. And then we have China, but if it's to become the sort of dominant power, there's a lot of writing about the way in which it's quite a unique system of government, the Chinese, where there's a lot of drawing from the bottom up in fairly complex ways, and some simply by doing surveys, but I've read a couple of books where they chronicle very in detail quite often that there is, as I said, some very sophisticated policy making. And it would seem that way in the sense that I don't think they're really badly wrong-footed, but they've been quite a stable decision-making system the last 40, 50 years. And I don't think, enough credit perhaps is given to the different way in which that functions. So all I'm asking is there not something in that system which has longevity? And if she goes, is there something which will carry it forward and possibly have a reasonably rational system of hegemony?
Well, Jerry, I think that's probably I answered that with the last question, saying that I consider the Communist Party surviving Xi for a very long time. There is that institutional structure, as you describe it. It does all of those things that you describe, and it has provided a highly stable government. Against all the odds, it's provided stable government. Now, you could say one-party authoritarian states, their single biggest weakness is the transfer of power, and that remains the biggest threat to the system. But on the other hand, if you've got, I don't know, David, 120 families running the show, They may well hate each other, but they know you hang together or hang separately. There's a powerful incentive to conceal your differences and get on with it.